When debating with atheists, they'll almost invariably whip out their favorite stock expression, "There is no evidence for God." Of course, they have no way of demonstrating this claim to be true, and when you point it out, they'll shift the burden of proof on you and demand that you provide them with evidence. Why would you demand evidence if you already said it doesn't exist? Now, the Christian apologist has several avenues available to them here. They could point to the first cause argument, or the contingency argument, or the fine-tuning of the universe, etc., etc., but no matter what they say, the response is invariably going to be the same. That's been debunked! Now, debunked is basically atheist speak for someone somewhere on the internet says this is wrong, therefore the matter is settled once and for all time. And there are 2 points I want to note here. First off, is just how illiterate this is. When you say an argument has been debunked, you're practically advertising the fact that everything you know about philosophy you learned from YouTube. Okay, Thomas Aquinas is not Uri Geller. If you feel an argument has been refuted, you say it's been refuted. Secondly, these people don't seem to understand that if you mount an objection to an argument, someone else can mount an objection to your objection. That's kind of the way the exchange of ideas works. These people don't really seem to get that. I've actually had an atheist tell me that before I use any Christian apologetic argument, I should Google the name of that argument along with the word debunked, and that only if that Google search yields no results should I use that argument. Yes, these are the rational atheists we're dealing with here. Now, luckily for all these brain-cased atheists, all these supposed debunkings that are floating around there on the internet have been compiled into one online resource called Iron Chariots, so that when they're debating with Christians on the internet, they could simply copy and paste from the website without having to think too much. And thankfully for us Christians, the good people of Iron Chariots effectively announce their stupidity through their website's very name. You see, the name is a reference to the Bible verse Judges 1:19, which they quote here as saying, "And the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron." Now they quote this as a supposed contradiction to the idea of God's omnipotence, as they seem to think it's saying it was God who could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. In fact, the verse is saying it was Judah and his men who failed to drive out the inhabitants. If this were unclear enough from context, most translations include the pronoun they, indicating it was the men, and not God, who couldn't drive out the inhabitants. With that out of the way, let's dive into one article on Iron Chariots, namely the article dealing with the ontological proofs of God's existence given by Saint Anselm in the 11th century and by Alvin Plantinga in modern times. Now, in attempting to refute these arguments, they throw a lot of shit at the wall, and none of it really sticks. There's too much to respond to here, so I'll just poke a few holes in some of their objections. My purpose is not so much to defend the ontological argument, as just to illustrate how badly atheists fail at logic. Affirming the consequent. Now, in their attempt to pin this fallacy on the ontological, they radically rephrase and dumb down both the premises and conclusion of the argument. The third premise, not the second premise, states that a being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. It's not saying that anything that exists has the quality of greatness. The premise establishes a difference of degree, not of quality. Also, the conclusion doesn't assume that if something has greatness, then it exists. The conclusion is that this great thing, namely God, does exist both in the mind and in reality. Again, they completely mischaracterize the premises and conclusion of the ontological argument, which completely voids their attempt at a refutation. Proof by logic. Here they criticize the ontological for not having any empirical premises, which just shows they completely misapprehend the force of the argument. If the argument was built on an empirical premise, it could only tell us what's true of this world. The ontological argument attempts to show that God exists in every possible world. Also, note that phrase effectively defines God into existence. That's an atheist talking point. Atheists will always say what they think an argument effectively or basically says, when they can't grapple with the actual argument. At the end here, they have two parody arguments that are supposed to underline a fallacy of Plantinga's ontological argument, and they both fail to do so for the same reason. In the first one, they define unicorn as being excuse me, unicorns. I mean, they're just so wacky and clever and original. Sorry for that, folks. Back on track. In the first premise, they say it's possible a necessarily existing unicorn exists, and then, through a proper application of the S5 axiom of modal logic, they deduce that the unicorn necessarily exists. And the argument is valid since, according to axiom S5, if something is possibly necessarily the case, it is necessarily the case. You don't need 6 steps to establish this. The argument is not sound, however, since it assumes a necessarily existing unicorn possibly exists, which is false. In Plantinga's ontological argument, the necessary existence of God isn't an assumption of the argument, it's a deduction of the argument. Next, we have their reverse ontological argument, where they attempt to use similar reasoning to prove that God necessarily doesn't exist, and oh boy is this a mess. Here in the second premise, we encounter the same problem, as they define God as being necessarily existing. Again, that was the conclusion of Plantinga's argument, not a premise of his argument. Plantinga defines God as a being of maximal excellence, with the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. If it's possible that such a being does not exist, as they say here in the first premise, all we could say is that God doesn't necessarily exist, not that God necessarily doesn't exist. But look at how they absolutely butcher the logic of axiom S5 in premise 3 and in the comments down below. P3 follows from S5 modal logic where all worlds are accessible to each other, so if something is possible in one world, it's possible in all worlds? What the hell are they talking about? Atheists absolutely fail at logic. It's all very simple, folks. If one premise of your argument says God necessarily exists, and another premise says God doesn't necessarily exist, then your premises are contradictory and the entire argument should be junked. There's no reason to drag the good name of axiom S5 into this mess. If you have ideas for any other Iron Chariots articles I should tackle, please leave it in the comments below. As an addendum to this video, I highly recommend you check out this excellent article on the excellent website First Things about Gödel and the ontological proof of God's existence. Gödel was arguably the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, and this article details his formalization of an ontological proof in symbolic logic and how it related to his own religious faith. The link is included in the description. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.